99% of candidates simply don't know how banking recruiting works. I led JP Morgan recruiting for 2 years, reviewed hundreds of resumes, and I've also helped over 100 students break into banking over the years. And today, I want to share with you 5 insider secrets that bankers never share publicly that will give you an edge against your competition. Alright, so let's jump in. First, let me give you an insider view into what the recruiting process looks like from inside an investment bank. First thing to know is that there are 2 very different recruiting pipelines for target and non-target students. If you go to a target school, which for most banks are the top 25 or so universities, then each bank will have a team of 5 to 10 bankers who lead recruiting for their respective schools. This is super important for you to know because if you do go to a target school, the fastest, most efficient way to get an offer is by speaking with those bankers who are leading recruiting and making a good impression with them. At most banks, target schools are allocated a certain number of spots for each super day. So for example, at JP Morgan, we were allowed to send 5 candidates from UC Berkeley for SF and 5 to New York, who then competed against all the other target schools for offers. The recruiting teams put in a ton of work on top of their 80 to 100 hour work weeks to send their top candidates from each school. So for us, it always felt like we were sending out our best gladiators out to battle, hoping they would demolish the competition, and we'd always be so happy whenever our candidates got offers. The second pipeline for non-targets at most banks is all kind of grouped into one really large pool of candidates. And so given you're competing against more people, it's a lot harder to break in. If you go to a non-target, speaking with bankers who went to your school is still super important because they're still the most incentivized to help you. Now, with all this said, there's some important nuance to the target versus non-target structure because many groups at even the top banks hire from specific universities based on the alma mater of their senior bankers or proximity. For example, at Moelis, one friend told me that the University of Arizona operated very much like a target school because the global head of capital markets got an MBA from there. Over a few cycles, they hired multiple Arizona students, and that created a mini pipeline. Another example, a bulge bracket in Chicago heavily favored the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign over multiple Ivy League schools because the 2 senior MDs were Illinois alumni and had been pulling from that pipeline for more than a decade. Proximity is also super important as well. One Houston Energy Group has a strong Texas A&M pipeline that Ivy League students often lose out to because the senior team believes that those students fit the culture and sector better. Similarly, a lot of the top tech groups like at Goldman and Morgan Stanley in the Bay Area hire from UC Berkeley instead of Ivy League schools because the alumni density is higher and there's a historic pipeline. These stories are a lot more common than you might think. Your school may be a non-target in general, but a priority target for one specific bank, city, or product group, and you can't really find this info on any website. The only way to discover these hidden pipelines is through insider conversations with bankers, which is why networking is not optional and required if you want to discover hidden advantages. On a related note on networking, the next thing most candidates don't know about banking recruiting is that you need to network much harder than you think you do. All of the top candidates I've come across have done the following for networking without exception. Sent hundreds and hundreds of emails to set up chats, spoke with 25 to 50 bankers by the end of their recruiting cycles, and prioritized in-person coffee chats over Zoom or phone calls. I find that most candidates truly have no idea that networking for banking recruiting is pretty much like a part-time job, given all the outreach, follow-up, and thank you emails you have to send, and all the time you spend speaking with bankers and commuting to their offices. Now, there are definitely outliers. You're gonna hear sometimes about candidates who apply to a bank, get an interview, and get an offer without much networking. But if you want to truly maximize your chances, you need to network way more than you think. The reason networking is so crucial for banking is simply because bankers don't want to spend 80 to 100 hours a week with people they don't like. Doesn't that sound like a nightmare? When you network the right way and make a strong impression with bankers, they'll go to bat for you during roundtable discussions when candidates are being selected for first round interviews and super days, and many banks will rank candidates based on how their coffee chats go. To give you a personal example, for the recruiting processes I was part of, there were always 1 to 2 candidates that really stood out to me from great coffee chats, and since I was leading recruiting, they would pretty much get super day invitations as long as they also had really strong resumes. One last little tip is that MDs and senior bankers are often not reached out to, so even though it can be intimidating, getting their support can also be massive if you can make a good impression with them as well. Now, if you resonate with what I've been talking about and you need help with networking, I actually put together all of my best recruiting advice into a completely free 15-part email newsletter that covers networking and every step of the banking recruiting process. You won't find the depth of advice I give anywhere else, and it's all based on my experience leading recruiting and helping over 100 students break into banking over the years. Check it out at rareliquid.com or scan the QR code on the screen if you're interested. Okay, so now you understand you need to network hard, but once you actually get in front of a banker for a coffee chat or interview, you need to know that most bankers will determine if they like you or not within the first few minutes. And so if you have a strong tell me about yourself and a clear story for why banking, bankers will immediately want to do the following: invest more time into the coffee chat or call, refer you to other bankers in their group, and or start rooting for you during the actual interview itself. I've held over 50 first round interviews and mock interviewed hundreds of students over the years, and when a candidate has prepared thoroughly, it's immediately super obvious. I've created a separate video about how to crush the tell me about yourself questions, so you can check that out if you're interested and want my tips. What you need to know is not to take your behaviorals lightly because they really set the tone for interviews, and you can't just rely on being good with technicals to get an offer. This is especially true for super days, which most students don't realize can often be more behavioral based than first round interviews, because super days are led by senior bankers who no longer go deep inside models, so they don't remember, for example, what the perpetuity growth formula is, and they're not going to ask you about those types of questions. Now, of course, they're still going to ask tough technical questions, but usually in a more creative and conceptual way. And quite frequently, what they're really doing is trying to see and check their gut for two things. First is if they can put you in front of a client based on your confidence and poise. And second is if you seem reliable enough to get mountains of work done during high pressure deals, and all of this is being tested within the first few minutes. You may also not know that before and beyond the first few minutes of an interview, candidates are constantly being monitored and judged. The absolute best banking candidates act like bankers. They reply to emails super quickly at all times of the day, they double check their messages and resumes for zero errors, and are confident during interactions to demonstrate that they're client ready. Whenever I or other bankers would have coffee chats or interview a candidate, we would always go to our desks and tell other bankers what our impressions were. When a candidate made a big error on their email by spelling a name wrong, that would go noticed, and when a candidate took days to reply, that would get noted as well. Banking recruiting is super intense because it mirrors the actual job itself, and that's why I always recommend to treat recruiting like an extra class or even two, and to take a lighter course load for your most important recruiting seasons. Alright, hope you found this video helpful, and if you're recruiting for banking or plan to in the future, as a quick reminder, I have a 15-part email newsletter that goes over all my best tips for investment banking recruiting, which you can sign up for at rareliquid.com. That said, thank you so much for watching as always, and if you're recruiting, best of luck with your process. Hope to catch you in the next video.